here with Ernest to discuss our podcast, Law of Biblical Mechanics. And today we're going to be discussing conflict resolution. We have Ernest here with us. So we're going to get started with a nice Bible verse to get us started. Then we're going to move into that topic of conflict resolution in the workspace and good leadership with it.
Well, thank you, Ashanti. It's good to be back with you. It's been a minute. This has been one of the hot topics that we have in leadership and project management. And as we discussed, Hebrews chapter 12, verses 14 through 15, it basically says, follow peace with all men and holiness, without no man can see the Lord, looking diligently, lest any man fail of the grace of God, lest any root of bitterness spring up, trouble you, and thereby many be defiled. Now that you have to unpack that. One of the things that we want to make sure is that we have peace. Peace in our families, peace in our home, peace as it relates to organizational development. And we want to get a hold of a root of bitterness. So a root of bitterness basically is something that is a foundational issue that can spring up and basically contaminate the whole organization, relationships. It's just like the love of money is the root of all evil. A root is something that feeds everything else. And if we are not aware of the root, and if we're not aware of these issues, what will end up happening is the little things will become big things. It's the little foxes that spoil the vine. So we want to make sure that we lock down what conflict is, how it kind of springs up, how we kind of neglect it, but then how it can also be a positive thing as well.
Absolutely. So when defining good leadership by accepting any type of change, going back to your change management principles, how do you usually see that in your everyday work experience, applying such principles and, biblical mechanics to such?
Well, one of the things that you want to make sure that you do is you want to make sure that with change management, you get everybody involved with the change. As we talked about earlier, change management has a lot to do with the fact that anytime you invoke change, you want to make sure that you get everybody involved. You want to make sure that the change is gradual, that it's collaborative, and also you want to define it. You want to have clear action steps because you have a lot of people in your organization that may have been around for a long time. And any type of change has a physiological effect on the individual. So you want to make sure that the change is collaborative, that everybody is involved. And what is the purpose of the change? We just don't have change just for the sake of change.
Right.
So you want to make sure that those ideas are defined clearly, and you want to make sure that you have empathy toward folks that have to actually be the ones to implement change. Mm-hmm. In other words, as a leader, manager, director, from a 40,000 foot view, you want to make sure that at the end of the day, everybody's involved. And it's not a dictatorial decision that's made from top down, but that it's crosswise, so it's collaborative. And that's key. Ultimately, the leader is obviously going to have the final say as far as change management, but you want to make sure everyone is involved because at the end of the day, again, it's the peace, it's the harmony, it's people focused on the goal. It has to be task-oriented and not personal.
Great. And with that being said, getting into conflict resolution, which it can oftentimes become a personal thing for employees and leaders that are operating under guidelines to meet those standards of empathy and see all sides, so with that being said, how do we address conflict resolution where people are not taking it personal? There's a sense of emotional intelligence being played out. How would you say as a leader yourself, you address conflict resolution?
Well, first of all, that's a good question, Ashanti. I think one of the things that you have to realize is that conflict is not all bad. We take it always as a negative, but conflict can expose weaknesses in your organization. And also it could expose a situation where maybe your policies and procedures have not been fully implemented the way they should. So one of the things as a leader is, number one, you have to have continuous meetings. You have to define your project management goals, or what I call the project charter and project management techniques. And in there, you define everything that needs to be done, whether it's change management or any type of policy and procedure change. You have to also make sure that it's not personal. A lot of people get offended when you bring about change management and conflict, because it can't be personal. It has to be something where it's task oriented and not people oriented.
Right.
And that's one of the things. And you have to be sensitive to that. Also, competition of resources is another issue that can cause conflict. In a high stress environment where there's not a lot of funding, there's not a lot of resources, different departments are fighting over that, it could cause conflict. People's task roles are ambiguous. That's another issue that causes conflict as well. How do you mitigate that? Right. So one of the things is, as a leader, you have to be sensitive, almost be out in front of the conflict even before it even starts.
Yeah.
You have to be sensitive, always get feedback from your staff, your organization, and from that point, you have to be in continuous improvement mode. That's really key. And at the end of the day, it's not personal, but it's a situation where everybody can have a role in the success of whatever that task or that project is.
Right. And we mentioned in a discussion we were having earlier off camera the big word collaboration, because yes, we will have upper management and then mid-level come together, but upper management has already talked and discussed and planned on how they want to execute a project or whatever it may be the case to meet those goals, but they didn't include mid-level people. So the mid-level,
yes,
employees are like, okay, you guys are giving us these instructions, but we're the ones got to walk in these shoes to
yes,
execute it. Why weren't we included? So I think that you discussed with me earlier the importance
yes,
of collaboration in that team building sense of meeting those goals and addressing conflict. Everybody should be in a room and not just these group of people, this one person, right?
Well, everybody should be in a room discussing the change and discussing the conflict and not being dictated to. I've been in a lot of organizations in the past where a lot of the change management, a lot of the impacts are already discussed before it's rolled out to staff. That's too late.
Yeah.
Because at that point, no matter how well you think that change is, or the mitigation is automatically going to cause a conflict, right?
Yeah.
A lot of people that have been there, that are subject matter experts, I'm very sensitive to them because they're your implementation arm. They're the ones that are going to have to carry that out. And the conflict will come in dictating to folks, this is what needs to be done, and either you deal with it or we move on. So that is not the way to deal with conflict, in my opinion. You have to bring everyone in and address it, what I call the head-on approach, the direct approach. That's in extreme cases where the conflict can't be mitigated. I think that's very important. You definitely don't want to do avoidance or smoothing either. And we talked about that, I think, in our previous broadcast, where we talked about smoothing, where we deal with everything else but the conflict at hand, or avoidance, where we pretend like it's not happening.
Yeah.
Those are very bad management tools. And eventually, you will have to deal with conflict, either on the front end or the back end.
Right.
I'd rather deal with it out front, where it's small, manageable, because if it gets to the point where it becomes large, it affects the organization. And we talked about in that scripture, the root of bitterness. And people get bitter and they take their assignments and their careers very seriously. And if you don't address that and find a way as a manager to kind of be a servant leader, it will have major negative impacts that we want to try to avoid. So,
and can you kind of just take us back down the road, because we spoke of this again in one of our previous podcasts, if you've been tuning in, of what exactly, how do you define a servant leader in the law of biblical mechanics?
Well, a servant leader is, there's a biblical principle that if you want to be kind of the head person or above everyone else, you have to be beneath everyone else. So it's a situation where your job is to assist everyone else to be great. And I think that's important. Leaders, again, going back to ego, going back to leaders thinking that they know everything. It's a very weak position. It's a very weak position being a leader there's a lot of weak points that you don't really discover until you're into a project, into a task.
Yeah.
And again, it's a situation where you really have to have your pulse on your staff, on your group, on resources, on all of those things. You'll have to almost think 3 steps ahead.
Yeah.
So being a servant leader really is making sure that your staff and your group, your organization, whatever that relationship group is, has everything they need to be successful. It is your job to make sure that that's the case, and to make sure that they already function in their position that they need to have to move forward. So that's really the long and short of being a servant leader, in my opinion.
Yeah, and it kind of cuts into why communication and integrity is such a key. And I think in order to know how to communicate and work with a sense of integrity, you got to know who you're working with.
Right.
Right. So like when you have a new hire or people being moved in, meet with them, discuss, get a vibe of where they are and meet them there. And then work with them on the goals, to lead to the advancement of the company, but if you don't know your staff and they don't know you,
right,
and they're just listening to it's like where they're judging from, you know what I mean? And then where are you judging from as well? And I think that's where it starts to get a little personal, because how else am I going to judge you besides off of my personal opinions or your personal opinions towards me when you don't know my work habit, you don't know the way that I like to mitigate, you don't know anything about me besides I work underneath you.
Right.
So what about that, like for leaders, like learning your staff?
That's very important. Martin Luther King mentioned one time about the drum major syndrome, that everybody wants to be out in front. Everybody has a certain pride about what they do, and they want to be seen, they want to be recognized. And a lot of times, it's as a manager, if you don't define certain tasks or goals properly, what will end up happening is people will start making it up as they go. There'll be conflicts as far as work assignments, who's tasked to do what. And as a leader, you need to make sure that those things are defined, especially when you're bringing on new staff, who they're going to report to, what items and things they're going to be responsible for. That has to all be done. And as a manager or a leader, meetings is always the case. And not to have meetings just to have meetings. There has to be clear goals, clear agendas, and coming out of that meeting has to be a clear, concise consensus on who's doing what, and make sure that everybody has a say. And there's no big I's and little U's there. Even as a leader, sometimes I think the temptation is to dictate policy, to dictate terms, but you want to be as collaborative as possible. Now, there will come a time where, as a leader, you will have to make a decision.
Yeah.
But as long as you've made the collaborative approach as far as making sure that everyone is involved. Hello, everyone. I'm Ernest R. Roberts III, owner and CEO of Roberts Consulting Engineers, PLLC. My career spans over 30 plus years in both the public and private sector, which includes my work as a licensed professional civil engineer and a certified project management professional. In my new book, The Law of Biblical Mechanics, Principles and Process for Management and Stewardship, will hopefully challenge your ego and current concepts that you've had about your life and how you interact with others. This book is also meant to be read and studied multiple times, and to hopefully be implemented immediately, as faith comes by hearing and not by having heard. I trust that you will be as impacted by the concepts and examples in this book as I have been. The Law of Biblical Mechanics is now available on Amazon, both in paperback and audiobooks. May you truly be blessed exceedingly and abundantly above all that you ask or think. No big guys, little you. You want everybody to feel like they contribute to the overall success. And if there's any issues, then you need to have one-on-one meetings with everybody. If it becomes a situation where the collaborative approach is not working, you still find that there's these rough spots when it comes to integrity, you definitely want to have one-on-one meetings. I think just to define where you as a leader stand and what you expect of the team and just your overall goals. I think especially at the beginning of change management, it can be very, very disconcerting. There's a lot of high passionate feelings, both positive and negative, to any type of change, which automatically brings in conflict, because again, people get in their comfort zones too as well.
Yeah.
Everything is about change. If you don't change, you're always going to have an issue where you're falling behind industry, technology, and there's going to be things that happen that are beyond your control where you're forced to change.
Yeah.
And like I said, change is not negative. It could be positive, but again, it has to be the collaborative approach. And also, there's two concepts. There's win-win and win-lose. You definitely want to be on the win-win side. You don't want to come out of conflict resolution that somebody feels like they lost. And that's not what we want. We want everyone to feel as though, regardless if the change or the conflict didn't necessarily go their way, they at least want to be in a situation where they can say, I can see where you're coming from and come to some sort of happy medium.
Yeah.
It doesn't necessarily mean that everything is going to be hunky-dory going forward, but at least they know that for the overall good of the team, that the items were discussed accordingly and we're moving forward. So I think that's important, and not to go behind people's back and go against your principles and what you've already established. I think that's very, very important. Trust, again, integrity is there. Once people see that, they're more willing to follow the change management, and hopefully that could be mitigated as far as conflict as well. So.
Yeah, and I do want to kind of hit on the emotional intelligence, because I wouldn't say there's a lack of, but when you're very passionate about what you do, that requires emotions, right? You put your all into that mentally, emotionally, and then when it's tested with the conflict, you got to know how to respond, like actually sit, think it out logically, and disconnect the emotions. That can be quite a challenge for those that are heartfelt people, and it depends on your career too at that.
Sure.
But if you're a heartfelt person, all you know is how to speak out your emotions rather than sit and logically know how to explain yourself. I think that's like the definition of emotional intelligence itself. But from your perspective as a leader, what would you define emotional intelligence as being?
Understanding everybody's different. Everybody doesn't react the same way. It's just like having children, right? All your children are not the same. You're going to have one that you may not have to say much to. They're self-starter. You may have another one that is going to require a little bit more hands-on training.
Yeah.
You have to know your staff. You have to know the people that you're dealing with. And as a leader, you have to take the time to do it. And I know a lot of times, because we're in a high-stress environment, that's not something that comes to the forefront. But let me tell you, if you don't get a handle on it, it will become an issue going forward.
Yeah.
So, the old saying is, you never know what's in the orange until you squeeze it. When that pressure comes on you, you see what comes out. And you want to make sure that what comes out is what has been deposited. So at the end of the day, you want to make sure you make good deposits into your people. You have to study your staff. There are some people that are very highly emotional about what they do. And, again, you have to know how to mitigate that.
Yeah.
And again, it may go back to one-on-one meetings, but at least you have to take the time to do that. A lot of times in the old models, again, it was more dictatorial. You didn't have an opportunity to do that. You put everybody in the room. This is what we're doing. This is what upper management and leadership has come up with, and it's going to happen on this date. Deal with it. And I think that's the wrong approach, especially in this environment when you talk about mental health, stress. People spend more time at their positions, at their jobs, than they do at their home with their families. And you want to make sure, again, going back to peace, anything that causes a root of anything that's negative, you want to dig it up, not at the level of the branches, not at the level of the leaves, but at the level of the root, because the root feeds everything else. And so when you talk about biblical mechanics in these scriptures and emotional intelligence, it's going back to the heart of what makes people tick and what makes them move and what motivates them. It's not the Maslow hierarchy of needs. That's basic, that people's basic needs need to be handled before the higher needs are handled. But you have to know your staff. You have to spend time with them, and it takes a amount of sacrifice because there's deadlines, there's reports need to be done. I'm in meetings a lot, and things of that nature. But part of your day has to be spent in dealing with your staff because everybody's not the same.
Exactly. And I think like Tupac said, all eyes are on you as the leader, okay? Like your staff is watching you because you are the leader. Like they're looking, they're speculating, like they seeing you leave out early all the time, you're not in the office. They're looking, they're saying things because it's like, don't talk to me about time management. Don't talk to me about being on time when you aren't, there. So with that being said, you have all eyes on you because you're the leader. You running the show and they trust you. Yep. They're trusting that you're going to get them to where they need to go in their role. And then as a collective, everybody's going to be able to be on the same wave based on your leadership. Yes. But yet they're seeing the imperfections that do exist sometimes in leadership. How do you address those things when you have a staff that's like keying in on you giving them tasks, but they're checking you on the tasks you're doing? Do you feel like, oh, maybe I hired the wrong people, or should I fire these people because they're checking me and I'm doing my job? Like, I guess it's an ego play thing too with that.
It is, but keep in mind also that leadership comes from the top, and I think that I never ask anybody to do anything that I'm not willing to do too. So you lead by example. I know that sounds like a cliche, but it's not. And when my staff sees that I go to bat for them, especially when it comes to policy, when it's budget time, when it's time for allocation of resources, and anything that they need to have their position to be even better, that I'm willing to go to bat. And I'm willing to basically make sure that the environment that we're dealing with isn't one that's conducive where you can come to me and say, hey, let's sit down and talk. I have these issues that's going on, so on and so forth. And it may necessitate a meeting with certain parts of the group or the whole entire group, because maybe it might be an issue that's been going on that you weren't aware of. And I think that's key for new leadership too. People that are first coming into an organization, the first thing you need to do is you have to have one-on-one meetings before you even have meetings with staff as a whole, because you want to basically figure out where everyone's coming from. And as I mentioned in the book, Law of Biblical Mechanics, we talked about that all the time. At the end of the day, they may be able to give you some advice just because of their long experience in that particular case, and it may actually change your mind as far as the change that you're trying to implement. Like I said again, with conflict, it's very dangerous. If you don't get out in front of it and you allow it to fester, that root ends up growing into a tree, and it becomes a big tree, and it's harder to get rid of that. You can't just pluck it up by your hands. You got to get the big chainsaw. That's the wrong time to deal with conflict, because now you're dealing with HR issues, you're dealing with reprimands, and it leaves a bitter taste in people's mouth. And at the end of the day, it all comes back on the leader. Regardless of what your staff is doing one way or the other, it always comes back on you as a leader, because upper management is not going to be concerned about the day-to-day nuances. And you could be 100% right and they could be 100% wrong. They don't care. At the end of the day, what is the results? They're paying you and they're putting you in a position so that, because you're more of a mouthpiece, you're more of a 40,000 foot view individual. You have to make sure everyone is operating a certain way, and that's your responsibility, no one else's. So I take it personal. So I wouldn't ask anybody to do anything that I wouldn't do myself.
Absolutely. Well said. Well to the point. Okay. So as we started with a biblical verse to bring us into the discussion of conflict resolution and being a great leader, what would you say as a takeaway would be something that we could consider in the Bible as kind of like the stepping stones from what's been discussed moving forward as a leader? What principle have you pointed out, I should say, that you feel will be like the end all be all to this conversation?
Well, again, it goes back to stewardship. Luke chapter 16, we talked about the unjust steward, and anyone that has an opportunity, you should go back and read that. I think this verses 1 through 11. Basically, we're responsible for managing typically other people's goods and services. And there's a biblical principle that says that if you're not willing to handle other people's business, you won't get your own. And again, it's just like I give somebody $5 and they mismanage $5. Why would I give them $5,000? Doesn't make any sense. Right. It's a principle, right? Everything builds upon, right? Because we're trying to develop character, leadership, and in that parable of the unjust steward, the steward knew what to do, but refused to do it. And again, the master or the manager of that steward found out third hand that he was wasting his goods. And I don't want anybody to find out third hand that you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing. And that makes me look bad. Because my job is not to micromanage you or anyone else. Because I hired you to do a job. I hired you to do a certain task, to manage these folks, whether it's 500, 5,000. It doesn't matter. The bottom line is we have certain skill sets that we need to be consistently consistent. And sometimes you have to roll your sleeves up and do the hard work, the things that you don't want to do. Managers spend 90% of their time communicating, more so than anything else. I mean, I look back at, my director position in this village, and it's funny because most of it's communication. I do a lot of emails, I do a lot of meetings, I do a lot of reports to our board, to regulatory agencies. A lot of it is communication. And what is the goal of what we're trying to achieve? More so than me just doing specific tasks. Obviously I have an engineering background and things of that nature, but at the end of the day, that's really what we're tasked to do, is we're tasked to manage resources, people, allocate all of that and make sure that it goes to a point where we complete the project. Excellency, accuracy, and boldness. That's the key. That's the key. And so I would just take away that we are nothing but stewards. I mean, at the end of the day, servant leadership, stewards, when you have that mindset and mentality, you'll go really far with that. And that's what I would say as a cap. And there's so many things from a biblical perspective, but that's one that kind of sticks out.
For sure. And I can see that. And it's about having the right attitude after that.
Exactly.
So thank you so much, Ernest.
Absolutely.
It's always a pleasure speaking with you. I hope that the audience take back a lot of leadership skills, great leadership skills, I should say, from what's been discussed today. And then also make sure that you purchase the book for additional information. Ernest, if you want to leave the audience off with some more information on how they can purchase your book.
So Amazon and Kindle. So we have the Law of Biblical Mechanics, Principles and Processes for Management and Stewardship. That's a mouthful, but it's an easy read. It's about 100 pages. And I wrote it in such a way where anybody, whether you're a manager, whether you're a husband, wife, whether you're just a friend or whatever the case is, anybody can take these principles and expand on it. It's easily written. We talk about biblical mechanics. We talked about practical examples and my personal examples and the different things that I cover in the book. And so again, it's a hot seller. I was proud of it. I never thought 2 years ago that I'd be writing a book. I was just led to do it, and it's really taken off. And really what we want to do is empower people. That's the key. And at the end of the day, you want to make sure that your principles are there. And it's not to criticize anyone, because we all have work to do to improve ourselves. So obviously, from a biblical perspective, there are things in the Bible that are very key that we can apply directly to our everyday life. So definitely, if you haven't gotten a copy, get one today. Amazon Kindle is right there for you.
Yeah. Definitely. And wishing you a good week ahead. Thank you. Stay tuned for our next podcast episode. We are now live.
Yes.
Woo!
Yes.
So you can listen to our previous podcast now on Spotify, also on YouTube. There are visual videos, but you're going to see us in person now. So I'm excited for that. We look forward to joining in on the conversation with you moving forward, and enjoy the rest of your week and be blessed.
Yes, absolutely.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.